Well, as the saying goes, 5th time's a charm? As you can probably tell, these breakdowns are getting longer and longer because the amount of problems with this show are compounding and getting more complex and more nonsensical. So, all aboard, let's get this over with. We return to the wacky, wonderful, time-bending charisma void that is Amazon's Middle-earth by rejoining my favorite character, Nori, who is teaching the stranger how to speak, and also explaining how the Harfoots migrate. As the writers have done, I think once before, they are actually using their characters to deliver exposition to the audience in a justifiable manner, as it makes sense in-universe for Nori to be telling the stranger how the Harfoots migrate. We learn that the Harfoots go to particular locations at specific times of the year, meaning that their migration patterns are pretty reliable. I will highlight that the stranger seems to be learning to speak extremely quickly, which can partly be explained by his clear magical ability, or potentially because it has in fact been months since we last saw them, which I can't actually confirm or refute because the show hasn't previously communicated the passage of time, so why would it start now? The stranger learns the meaning of the word peril, and concludes that he is peril, as he accidentally killed the fireflies in episode 2. This, if we assume that the stranger isn't playing dumb and is in fact a totally innocent simpleton, means that he didn't mean to kill the fireflies and that he appears to feel remorse for having done so. Nori tells him,
"You're good. Because you're here to help."
This is an interesting line. Either Nori is foreshadowing the rather Ian McKellen-like appearance that this guy will eventually take on, or she is simply concluding that he is a good person because he is helping her family. This would suggest, of course, that Nori does not consider the other Harfoots to be good people, as they are in fact not helping her family migrate, because they are, and I have grown quite attached to calling them this, barbaric troglodytes. Nori's mother calls her back and she returns to her family's caravan. They suggest that Poppy lighten the mood and sing them a jaunty tune that her mother used to sing. The same mother that the insular cult of selfish psychopathic leprechauns decided to leave behind after her alarm clock didn't go off and she got eaten by a bear or whatever the explanation was that they gave for this. And sing them a jaunty tune she does, aided to no small degree by pitch correction software.
My strength tells me no, but the path demands yes.
And whilst you may think this is a nitpick, of course a modern production uses pitch correction software, that is only part of my criticism. The song being sung, and the way it is being sung, could not sound less like a Harfoot song if it tried.
Please promise to find me this wandering day.
Go to the bottom I go, to heal my heart and drown my woe. Rain may fall and wind may blow.
If you had asked me which culture this song is from, Harfoots, men, elves, orcs, or dwarves, my guesses would have been men, elves, then Harfoots, then dwarves and orcs, in that order. The Harfoots are not very articulate, they have pretty thick accents, including Poppy, and yet when she is singing, I assume that it is the actress doing the singing, she sounds like a modern-day pop singer.
Pretty pathetic, huh?
And then we see a montage of Nori's family struggling through various hazards, such as what appears to be a marshland, because I have to assume there was no way for them to go around this, and oh, look, there's another cart here. Maybe this one belonged to Tonky Binglebam and his 7 children who looked after him due to his being born with no legs, and then they got stuck in the swamp and the Harfoots kept on migrating without even noticing. You fuck! Anyway, at one point Nori's family stop and pitch a tent for the evening, and there appears to be a thunderstorm outside because we can see thunder accompanied by a storm, which are the 2 key components of a thunderstorm. But notice I said appears to be a thunderstorm because the shots inside the tent indicate that no, there is in fact not a thunderstorm, because despite all the large holes in the fabric they use to make their tent, the Harfoots and all of their clothing are bone dry. This show cost $500 million to make, and apparently no one caught this.
Pretty pathetic, huh?
Anyway, apart from rather significant continuity errors, this montage shows us that in spite of having been abandoned by their cult, Nori and her family appear to be in high spirits as they presumably have each other, and they are also at ease with the stranger. There isn't anything here to indicate that they are being particularly friendly to him, but they're definitely not hostile to him anymore. And then this sequence ends with these 3 strange-looking androgynites who appear to be at the crash site from when the stranger arrived back in episode 1. We learn nothing about them, so I will continue for now. Cut to Adar, who is checking out some sun, and he is approached by an orc. In spite of the fact that this orc has made the effort to cover himself, the sun is in fact on his face multiple times in this scene, which we can add to the list of times where the orc's reaction to sunlight is horrendously inconsistent. The orc tells Adar that they have completed the tunnel. Adar tells the orc to hold his arm out in the sunlight, which he does, and it starts to burn. Adar tells the orc that he wishes the orc could feel the warmth of the sun as he does, as soon the sun will be gone. He then tells the orc to summon the legions, for it is time. So this short scene tells us a little about Adar's character. We knew from his previous scene that he shows kindness to orcs, almost treating them as if they are his children, or at the very least his pets. He does not treat them how an orc might treat another orc, for instance. In this scene, however, we learn that Adar voluntarily subjects the orcs to pain, suggesting that he doesn't particularly care for them. Well, another contradiction. If this is contextualized further in future scenes, I will revisit this, but for now, the reason this happens is so that Adar can tell the audience that the sun will soon be gone, and with him the part of it that knows its warmth. I will be charitable here and assume that whatever his evil plan is does not literally involve getting rid of the sun, but that it will potentially block out the sun, presumably so as to enable the orcs to move around during the day, even though they can already do so if they wear the right kind of hat. Sometimes, maybe. What he means by the part of him that knew its warmth is unclear, potentially foreshadowing, so again, until we get some concrete answers, I won't say much else. Okay, so Adar cares about orcs, but also inflicts needless pain on the orcs. Cut to Bronwyn in Ostirith. She and Arondir are about to address the citizens, which tells us two things. Firstly, that this is taking place immediately after where we last left them in episode 4, meaning that this plotline cannot be running concurrently with either the Harfoot plot or the Elrond plot. Secondly, it tells us that Bronwyn was not just being egotistical and presumptuous when she told us that she believes herself to be in charge because everyone who turned up at the garrison implicitly gave her that right, but that she is, in fact, in charge. And not one single person here decided that actually maybe a medic isn't the optimal choice of leader.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
Before I cover the meat of this scene,
and give it to me raw.
I will mention that a lot of people have correctly pointed out that in this crowd of villagers there are multiple instances of people, and even groups of people, being copied and pasted. This is simply an error in visual effects, as it does not convey the desired effect of there being a crowd of people here, as many of them are clones of each other. I don't really consider this to be an issue, although this is absolutely unacceptable given the scale of this production and the amount of money involved. I consider shots like this to be indicators as to the level of effort that went into the production. If you can't even do something as simple as hire a few extras to stand in a crowd together, then how can you be trusted to do anything else? Maybe they wanted to do this, but couldn't because they were filming during COVID, but if so, there are still better ways to simulate a crowd of people than to literally copy and paste them. Anyway, Bronwyn delivers Adar's message to the people, and she doesn't sugarcoat it in the slightest, indicating that she is willing to be very direct and to the point, even if it may cause upset.
Our enemy vows to attack. In exchange for mercy, we have been ordered to abandon this tower and swear fealty to their commander.
So I guess the humans are gonna leave because they don't really have any other options. They don't have a military leader, they don't have any food, there doesn't appear to be any weapons.
But if you choose to stand with me and fight, this tower will no longer be a reminder of our frailty, but a symbol of our strength. Who will stand with me? Who among you will stand and fight?
Oh, alright, my mistake. Bronwyn, the medic, is going to lead the people into battle against the orcs, who, as Arondir must be aware, vastly outnumber them. There is no reason to stay here. But as I mentioned in part 4, the world building in this show is so trash that we have no idea where they actually are in Middle-earth. All we know is that they are somewhere in the Southlands. We don't know what is near them, and we don't know how far they would have to travel to be out of danger. This could be fixed with a throwaway line, but if your goal is to turn Bronwyn into a girl boss who will show the boys how it's done, and then have the citizenry actually, for some reason, be convinced that staying and fighting is a good idea because some woman said that they should stay, then why would you concern yourselves with such minor things as world building? So as to leave no ambiguity around my use of the term girl boss, I will elaborate. By girl bossing, I am referring to the shallow and unjustified attempt to turn a female character into a badass, no-nonsense, confident gal who embodies what are typically masculine traits and doesn't care what people think of her. Even though Galadriel is an absolute fetid gash of a character, I do not consider her to be a girl boss. She is an immortal, centuries-old elven warrior. I take zero issues with her being able to do insane acrobatic martial feats, or even her ordering people around. There is a laundry list of problems with how the show depicts Galadriel doing these things, but I would not consider her to be a girl boss due to the in-universe justifications for her ability to do these things. With Bronwyn, this is very much not the case. So, I will draw a very quick comparison to one of my favorite characters from one of my favorite movie trilogies, Éowyn from The Lord of the Rings. Éowyn is the niece of the King of Rohan. She is at least somewhat capable with a sword. She finds herself being repeatedly pushed aside to tend to the less physical, less dangerous, and more womanly duties such as looking after the children.
I'm to be sent with the women into the caves.
That is an honorable charge.
To mind the children, to find food and bedding when the men return. What renown is there in that?
She tries multiple times to fight alongside the men, but is told not to because the battlefield is not a place for a woman. Eventually, she disobeys her father and rides into battle while disguised as a man, and eventually defeats the Witch King of Angmar but is badly injured in the process. This proves that she is very driven, very resilient, incredibly brave, and that she is more than capable of fighting alongside the men. One of the things that makes Éowyn so remarkable is that she perseveres to do what she considers right, even though she is very much out of place amongst the soldiers. The thing that makes Éowyn stand out is that she is a woman in a man's world. If it were instead Theoden's son Theodred who had this character arc, it simply would not make sense on a fundamental level. So, let's take Éowyn and put her here in Ostirith addressing the people of the Southlands. I do not believe that Éowyn would have been able to convince them to stay. Éowyn, in spite of all of her accomplishments during The Lord of the Rings, is not intimidating. She is not particularly charismatic, and she is not an incredibly accomplished warrior. She would have no right nor ability to lead these people. She would be laughed at, and rightfully so. Bronwyn, on the other hand, is apparently all of these things that Éowyn is not. Bronwyn is, apparently, a competent leader, a charismatic speaker, an intimidating presence, and a capable fighter. She can fight orcs and chop off their heads because she is a super badass, you see. She is also in charge of everyone because the script decided that she is in charge, you see. She convinces them all to fight for her because the script decided that this is even remotely a good idea by obfuscating the alternative. I don't believe that Bronwyn is in fact any of these things. She is a small woman who is a village medic.
Pretty pathetic, huh?
Maybe Bronwyn's character arc will take her somewhere interesting, but as it is, we've known Bronwyn for half a season, and she is already more competent than Éowyn in pretty much every way. I know that as the scene progresses, it becomes evident that she did not in fact convince everyone to stay and fight, but before Waldreg ruined everything, Bronwyn had succeeded where she should have failed. Had Bronwyn in fact failed to do this, and as a result lost a load of people, this could have given her somewhere to go in terms of development and a motivation for going there. She wants to be a good leader, but the people don't believe in her. They don't trust her. She hasn't earned it. She would then be able to grow as a character. But character growth, I think it is safe to say, is unfamiliar territory for the writers of Rings of Power. Evidently, they just didn't realize that in order to make a strong female character, you have to do more than just make them the best. To conclude on this thought, the way women are depicted in Rings of Power as being the equals to men in all regards is not inherently a problem. There is no reason why this can't be the case. It is, after all, a fantasy setting, and it could entirely be that men and women share the same level of physical strength, for instance, provided we ignore the obvious signs like broad shoulders and muscle mass. Yeah, okay, whatever. I'll hand wave it for the sake of making the point. As I have said previously, I don't care if Rings of Power is loyal to the books. I care if it is good in its own right. And the reason why I do consider this to be a problem is because the writers are trying to tell me that Bronwyn is the best and in charge, etc., without the character earning any of it. She is depicted as remarkable, and yet every society in Middle-earth appears to be a beacon of equality, meaning there is in fact nothing remarkable about her. She did not break free from any societally enforced norms. She is just the best, and she is in charge, you see. The thing that made Éowyn remarkable was that she excelled as a woman in a world of men. Bronwyn, conversely, is excelling as a person in a world of people. Okay, so Bronwyn is direct in her speech, is charismatic and compelling, and can convince people who don't know her to fight and die alongside her. Anyway, Waldreg then sows some seeds of discord, as if you recall from the last episode, he was revealed to be a baddie. He says that they will die and that instead they should bow to the enemy. This is odd because Adar's demand was that the people leave the garrison and bow to him, and the show still hasn't explained why they can't simply leave the garrison and not bow to him.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
Arondir responds that the enemy is not their deliverance, and Waldreg replies,
You are. Elf!
Alright, so now I'm really confused. The outcome of this scene is that a good number of people decide not to stand and fight with Bronwyn. They instead decide to follow Waldreg. This means that there was actually no narrative purpose behind having all of them raise their hands in solidarity with Bronwyn. and it appears to have been written in this way solely to tell us how much of a girl boss she is. They absolutely could have had Bronwyn argue with Waldreg, which actually may have given us some insight into these characters beyond he's a shifty old weirdo and she's the best, you see. But instead, they decided to let Bronwyn have her moment where everyone was like, yeah, woo, you're awesome, only to have them then decide, actually, nah, let's go with the old creepster. Maybe there is another reason why the writers chose to do this, but I'm not seeing it. And then we see Waldreg trying to get Bronwyn's son Theo to come with him, saying,
Theo, it's our chance. It's our time. Come with me, comrade.
This is also very strange. Is his plan for him and Theo to accidentally on purpose lead the humans to Adar and be like, oh, whoops, wrong turning. Anyway, master, here's your slaves. Because this line confirms Waldreg clearly appears to have some kind of plan beyond simply leaving Ostriath and surviving. Anyway, Theo decides not to go with him, and we see that a good number of people have in fact stayed behind. A nice wide shot to indicate how many people there are in total, how many have stayed with Bronwyn, and how many have left with Waldreg would have been nice, because as it appears, the Southlands consists of about 50 people, maybe half of which have left, maybe? Oh well, I guess $1 billion doesn't allow for that many extras. Alright, so Waldreg is highly motivated to be evil, and yet is strangely forgetful. We then cut to Numenor, where Elendil is overseeing their preparations to leave and fight for Galadriel. Isildur approaches his father, who brushes him off.
Father.
Isildur.
May we speak?
We learn from Isildur that his initial plan to go west is actually less important to him than doing something worthy of Numenor. This informs us that Isildur really wants to do stuff, but he isn't really sure what specifically. Isildur is initially training to be in the Sea Guard for what we can assume is months, if not years, before quitting a week before he will pass, because what he actually wants to do is go to West Numenor for reasons that are not explained, but then actually what he wants to do is serve in the Queen's army because he deems it to be worthy of Numenor.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
This could suggest that Isildur puts a lot of value in heritage and pride in his country/nation, but what it also does is tell us that Isildur is ping-ponging between really wanting to do different things and is making up reasons for wanting to do them.
Pretty pathetic, huh?
Anyway, Elendil actually calls Isildur out on this and asks him,
Not till I've done something worthy of Numenor.
And what is that? In your words.
oh boy, are we actually going to get some kind of explanation from Isildur as to why he is doing what he is doing? Isildur replies,
I don't have words for it.
Do you know what autistic is?
Yeah, so Isildur does in fact have no idea what he is doing, and he has no idea what he wants to do, hence him trying really hard to find what he wants to do by doing everything, I guess? This character is a goddamn mess. Elendil tells us that they have far more volunteers than they could possibly accommodate, which suggests that Numenor's military power must be pretty substantial. As we learn later, it is not, in spite of Numenor not being a small city and appearing to be very technologically advanced, at least by Middle-earth standards. Isildur asks his father to slip him to the front of the line, which would guarantee that he joins the army. This is further evidence that Isildur is willing to abuse his father's power and position to get what he wants. He apparently only got on the Sea Guard because of his father, and now he wants to take advantage of Elendil's rank yet again to get a spot in the army. And next week he'll be like, yo dad, the army's boring. What I really want is to be a chef. Get me a job in this kitchen. Elendil, thankfully, decides not to make the same mistake twice and treats his son like any other would-be soldier.
What are your qualifications?
Qualifications?
Do you belong to the Sea Guard?
You know I'm twice the same.
Do you belong to the Sea Guard? What about the Queen's Guard? Merchant's Guild?
This is about uniform.
Horseman's Guild?
You're being absurd.
This is an odd thing to ask, given that both of Isildur's buddies that were also kicked off the Sea Guard are now in the army, in spite of having presumably the exact same qualifications as Isildur, which suggests that the real reason that the answer is no is because Elendil sees it as a punishment, or possibly that he wants to protect his son from the dangers of battle. He tells Isildur that while he was feigning fidelity to Numenorian tradition, the other men on the island were actually living them. He is essentially, and rightfully, calling his son a scatterbrained poser. He continues that the men of Numenor found their own ways to contribute and serve the city, and suggests that this is something Isildur does not actually care about. I have to agree, given what we know about Isildur at this point, meaning that Elendil is doing precisely what he should be doing, which is nice. Isildur replies that he is in fact ready to serve, which is not a particularly convincing argument either to me or his father, who tells him that as he got himself booted from the Sea Guard, he has had his chance and will not be permitted to join the army. Okay, Isildur is indecisive to the point of absurdity, claims to value his country, and repeatedly abuses his father's position to get what he wants. And Elendil apparently learns from his mistakes and is a stern father. We then cut to the palace in Numenor, where the people are evidently very unhappy about the Queen Regent's decision to sail with Galadriel to fight Sauron. This doesn't quite mesh with what we were shown at the end of episode 4, but I guess that scene was meant to be uplifting and inspiring because it happened at the end of the episode, and therefore realism and consequences are not a factor here.
Pretty pathetic, huh?
The citizens are yelling at Pharazon, asking why he is sending their people to die. The fact that Pharazon is leaving the palace could suggest that he was previously addressing the people of Numenor before they became riled up and he was unable to subdue them. In fact, I can't think of another reason why Pharazon would be leaving the palace while surrounded by an angry mob, so I have to assume this is in fact what happened. Anyway, we then get this.
Forgive me for not sending word to you sooner. It's been a trying week.
Why didn't he stop this?
So, this line tells us a lot. These two are apparently now a romantic couple, at least to some degree, and presumably we are currently a week or so after the end of episode 4. I am willing to assume that this is the case because these two no longer appear to be interacting with each other as if they don't know who the other one is, so I will assume that in the last week their relationship has developed off-screen. Kemen tells Earien that his father Pharazon is loyal to the Queen Regent even if he doesn't agree with her. Kemen then tells us,
There are many who feel as you do. Not enough to sway him yet, but given the right push.
It must be you. He will listen to you.
So, again, this doesn't really work. This is suggesting that Earien knows Kemen well enough now to appeal to him to change his father's mind. This isn't something that you say to someone that you have just met, which until this scene was very much my impression of these two characters from what the show has previously shown us.
When I speak, his ears close up.
However, it simultaneously tells us that Earien does not know Kemen well enough to know that his father doesn't particularly value his thoughts and thus does not listen to him. These two things are mutually exclusive and cannot both be true.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
Which means that the writers, in trying to vastly accelerate this Kemen-Earien romance plot, are causing their relationship to be fundamentally unbelievable. The scene ends with Earien telling Kemen to speak louder to his father, indicating that she has faith that he can in fact change Pharazon's mind, which also tells us that she is very much against Numenor going to war. Okay, so this scene told us that Pharazon is, in some instances, unable to control crowds. We learn that Earien is very much against the war. And we learn that Kemen thinks with his dick. And we then see that Halbrand is smithing in the smithery, which must mean that, yes, he has a guild crest. We learn in the following scene that this is not the one he stole from Captain Social Commentary in episode 3, but it was in fact given to him by Pharazon. We see that Halbrand is working for the same blacksmith that he approached in episode 3, which causes a couple of problems. The blacksmith previously refused Halbrand a job because he does not have a guild crest, only to then offer Halbrand a job a few days later because he now has a guild crest.
That's a damn stupid thing to do.
I was going to propose that maybe more time has passed than a few days, but in thinking about it, I have found that it definitely is, in fact, only a few days, which causes further problems. The joys of this goddamn show! Halbrand was refused the job by the blacksmith and also stole Captain Social Commentary's guild crest, only to then be beaten up and arrested. All of this happened on the same day. The next indicator of the passage of time is Captain Social Commentary's bruises and dialogue when he is ranting about them taking your gerbs, leading me to assume that the day Galadriel met the Queen Regent is the very next day. Galadriel, as we know, does this.
There is a tempest in me.
And is subsequently locked up next to Halbrand, who could only have been there for a day at most. This is where things get slightly less clear. There is no concrete indicator as to the amount of time that Galadriel actually spent in prison before doing this. But given that Pharazon and the Queen Regent want her gone as soon as possible, and given that Pharazon arrives to escort her to the docks to leave this evening, I think it is reasonable to assume that Galadriel was in prison for maybe a few hours. And as we see at the end of episode 4, Halbrand is not in prison on that same evening when Galadriel supposedly departs Numenor. This means that Halbrand was in prison for, at most, 24 hours.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
In the previous scene, Kemen told Earien that it has been a trying week, which either means that he just had a generically busy week, or it means that he was specifically referring to the events of the show that we have been seeing, meaning that the Numenor plotline in episode 5 is taking place approximately a week after the end of episode 4. This is also supported by Pharazon saying in the end of episode 4 that they will depart in 10 days' time. However, there is no reason why what we are seeing right now with Halbrand and the blacksmith could not literally be the next day, and this vague line is the only thing to suggest more time has passed. And it is admittedly a very thin piece of evidence, but I'm trying to be unreasonably charitable to make a point. What this means is that Halbrand was rejected for a job on the basis that he does not have a guild crest, and then at most a week later he returns and gets a job because he now has a guild crest.
Oh yeah, it's all coming together.
This is absurd. This would be like me applying for a job and being told I need a particular degree, only to return a few days later with a piece of paper saying degree on it. That isn't how this works, unless we're expected to believe that that is in fact how it works in Numenor. Of course, this could have been fixed very easily by having Halbrand go to a different blacksmith, because then this wouldn't be a problem in the slightest, as the other blacksmith wouldn't necessarily know that Halbrand had only arrived in Numenor a few days prior, and thus could not have earned his guild crest yet. That would have made sense, and yet once again Rings of Power chose to do the exact opposite. Anyway, Halbrand is interrupted and told that he has visitors before being escorted to see Galadriel. That isn't what a visitor is. Fuck you, yes it is. We then see that Halbrand has been taken to see Galadriel, Pharazon, and the Queen Regent. They ask him about the enemy in the Southlands, which if you recall Halbrand knows about because he claims his village was destroyed by orcs. Halbrand tells them where the orcs went next, and Pharazon says he will leave to inform the Sea Guard. I have no idea why the Sea Guard would need to know where the orcs went after they attacked Halbrand's village, because surely if anyone, the military generals might need to know that rather than the sailors. Especially because the show has made it explicit that the Sea Guard and the army are not the same entity. But alrighty then. It is then revealed that Galadriel lied to the Queen about what Halbrand had actually said to her in order to get what she wanted.
Galadriel informed us of your aspiration to unite your people.
Did she now?
I trust she was not speaking in haste.
Yes, this is something that actually happened in this scene. Halbrand had made it clear to Galadriel multiple times that
I don't want it.
And yet Galadriel has apparently convinced the Queen to muster an army entirely because of Halbrand's supposed kingship. To be clear, the Queen has not decided to go and kill some orcs and save the villages. She has decided to take back the Southlands for Halbrand to assume the throne. If we assume that Halbrand is indeed the heir to the throne of the Southlands, if it can't be proven and he has no desire to sit on that throne, then there is no way that he can be forced to do any of this. But as Galadriel has evidently convinced the Queen that, yeah, Halbrand is really cool and he totally wants to lead us into battle and reclaim his homeland with that armor you were so generously providing, even though this is utter bullshit. What Galadriel wants to do is some combination of kill orcs and locate and defeat Sauron, and potentially if some mortals can not die in the process, then she might also facilitate that. Therefore, Galadriel has lied to the Queen to get what she wants. Even when Halbrand tries to back out of this, Galadriel only pushes him further into it.
I trust she was not speaking in haste.
As a matter of fact, it was my intention.
companion is merely feeling the weight of his task. I have no doubt, come time, he will do his part.
It is definitely worth highlighting here that the Queen has caused a significant amount of unrest in her kingdom, and she has done so partly due to the sign from the gods, but also in good part due to Galadriel convincing her that Halbrand really wants to save the Southlands and assume his kingship. Halbrand in this scene is very obviously extremely apprehensive about doing so, and the Queen just kinda ignores this. Halbrand was imprisoned after attacking multiple people in the street, and he's now showing himself to very much not be the person that Galadriel said he was. Some alarm bells should be ringing, my dear. Then the Queen is called away to do a thing. Yeah, this isn't revealed later in the episode. The script just required that she not be here now so that Galadriel can talk to Halbrand in private. I guess it's slightly better than having her just leave the room without a word. Marginally. So, we're about to get some explanations for what happened in episode 4. This is a rarity, I know, but as I keep saying, when we get further context, I will revisit those scenes and withdraw criticisms if appropriate. Galadriel apparently did work out that Halbrand told Pharazon that she was going to see the Queen after she broke out of prison. She also worked out somehow that he did this in exchange for a guild crest. This clarifies my criticisms from the previous episode, notably that Halbrand had no reason to tell Pharazon where Galadriel is going, and that Galadriel is indeed aware that he had done this. Of course, the whole guild crest thing still doesn't make a lick of sense, but I guess it's something? Is an explanation that doesn't make sense better than no explanation at all? Probably not, actually. Halbrand doesn't appear to care about any of this, and says,
"You used me, after I all but begged you to let me be."
This tells us that he is extremely displeased that Galadriel has manipulated him into doing something he doesn't want to do, and that he doesn't have any comments on his turning her in exchange for the guild crest. Although Halbrand is clearly very angry with Galadriel right now, he was on what were probably the best terms he has ever been with her just before she escaped the prison. He was giving her advice on how to talk to people, which she desperately needed, and she actually accepted. So, although Halbrand's current anger with Galadriel is very much justified, it does not justify why he turned her in exchange for the Guild Crest. Anyway, Galadriel defends her manipulation of him and her lying to the Queen by saying that she has convinced her to send 5 ships containing 500 men to aid Halbrand's people. So as to not get sidetracked, I will not comment on the size of the Queen's army yet, but believe me, I will later. And Galadriel says that many might assume that he in fact used her. This can only make sense if by many might assume she is referring to the Queen Regent who might assume this. Galadriel discovered Halbrand's lineage, she then revealed this information to Halbrand, and she then convinced the Queen Regent to assemble an army to take back the Southlands. It is entirely possible, with the information that the Queen Regent is aware of, that she does believe that Halbrand in fact manipulated Galadriel into doing exactly what he wanted.
Why me? Why me?
My question is why Galadriel would say this to Halbrand.
I have just convinced Numenor to send 5 ships and 500 men to aid your people and place a crown upon your head. Many might assume you used me.
This is the kind of thing you say to someone if you are blackmailing them, but she already has what she wants. There is no reason for her to say this. All it will do, and all it does, is further piss off Halbrand and cause him to walk away. Now, because my brain is feeling particularly charitable, let's look at this another way. Galadriel learned from Halbrand that when negotiating, she should identify what her enemy fears most and give them a means to master it. Is this what she just did to Halbrand? Well, technically, yes, although not in the way that Halbrand could have intended when he gave her that advice. Galadriel knows that Halbrand does not want to take the throne, which she likely attributes to his fear of confronting his enemy. She then assembled an army to allow him to do so, thereby identifying what Halbrand fears and giving him the means to master it. So, this appears to be the first example of what I would consider to be a clever and very subtle payoff in the entire show thus far. However, given that Halbrand was initially giving that advice to Galadriel with specific reference to her speaking with the Queen, given that Galadriel did not actually heed that advice when she next spoke to the Queen, given that Galadriel revealed that she potentially took Halbrand's advice in a very combative and undiplomatic way for no explicable purpose, and given that the writing in this show has been almost universally garbage, I think it is far more likely that this was an accident rather than a deliberate use of subtext. Okay, so the Queen is not perceptive and is easy to fool, and Galadriel is manipulative and only cares about what she herself wants. We then return to Nori's family, who are still migrating. They are in a spooky forest, which they don't like.
I don't like it here.
It's okay, dear. It's just the trees.
What madness made them go this way?
As this is a forest, it is certainly preferable to the swamp that they went through previously, but this forest apparently deserves special recognition for being spooky. So I assume they are leading to something. We then see that there are wolf tracks in the dirt, and this short scene ends. We then see Sadok and Malva, who appear to be in the same forest, and are observing that the woods are never usually bare this time of year. And Malva assumes that the stranger is the reason for this. Presumably they see him as a bad omen or something, which is in character given their established superstitions. Sadok asks what she wants him to do about it, and she replies,
"Take their wheels and leave them."
Yeah, and while you're at it, just slit their fucking throats in their sleep, you egocentric tin can of a person. Sadok's response here also suggests that he considers this a shockingly inappropriate suggestion. Presumably he has forgotten about the long list of people he abandoned to die in the wilderness in years past. Anyway, Malva continues by saying,
"What's it gonna take? Make a widow of somebody? Or an orphan?"
Implying that she considers widowing or orphaning someone to be a bad thing, which is at odds with her established complicity in the abandoning and subsequent deaths of the less fortunate.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
We also learn that people are getting hungry, suggesting that due to the state of the forest, they are having trouble finding food. Then this happens. Oh, okay, so they weren't really abandoned then. They managed to keep up? Somehow? This was not made clear whatsoever. Also, why did they approach Malva in this way? Was it to give the audience a jump scare? Also, why does Malva not seem shocked to see them there, given that she abandoned them presumably days, if not weeks, prior?
Pretty pathetic, huh?
Anyway, they tell Malva that they are worried because there are lots of wolf footprints in the mud, which I assume means that wolves hang out in this barren forest because they enjoy being in places where there is not food. Then there are spooky sounds, and Malva, Poppy, and Nori run away and are pursued by wolves. Malva appears to struggle to keep up, and instead of leaving her behind, Nori appears to help her get to relative safety. I can only assume she will be thoroughly berated for breaking the rules yet again. Actually, this isn't even relative safety. I assumed they were climbing this tree, but they've just kind of stopped next to it, and Malva has sat down.
That's a damn stupid thing to do.
The Harfoots evidently have the survival instincts of autistic lemmings. Nori tries to snap a branch off, presumably to use as a weapon, because of course she is brave, and then they are saved at the last second by the stranger who throws the wolf away from them. I would have a problem with this if he were not a wizard, but I'm happy to grant that he could and would take this action, although his timing is impeccable. Anyway, he then magics the wolves away, thus saving the Harfoots, but seemingly injuring his arm. This tells us that he is able to perform magical feats voluntarily, but presumably is still working out the kinks. So, on the face of it, what the stranger does in this scene is justified and in character, although the circumstances in which he decides to do this are very much contrived, as Malva accidentally crossed paths with Nori and Poppy, who then just so happened to get attacked by wolves in the vicinity of the stranger, who is then able to save them, making this scene about as clunky a way of resolving the Harfoots' prejudice against the stranger as possible. We then see the Numenorians training for battle. There appear to be 11 soldiers present, and they also appear to be training in some random stairwell in Numenor somewhere, which is an odd choice of location to train your army. Galadriel approaches Elendil, who is training them from a distance, and she says,
"Their strokes fall like the stone giants of the Northmoors."
So I took this to mean that she is somewhat impressed with their skill, rather than that she is just saying, their swords are loud. But as with most metaphors in this show, I honestly have no idea. She states that the men of Numenor will be unfamiliar with how to defeat an orc in combat, which makes a degree of sense as they have never fought orcs before. Elendil asks Galadriel to educate the volunteers, and she accepts. So, before this scene gets going, I will say at this point that I will not be breaking down the specifics of the fight itself. If you want that, check out Shadiversity's review, which is fantastic. What I will do instead is cover the broad decisions made by the characters in this scene, and what we can draw from them. So, Galadriel tells us that there are many ways to kill an orc, and that the way the Numenorians should go about doing so is...
stab, twist, gut.
Firstly, if these recruits did not already know that stabbing is a good way to kill a thing, then the Numenorians are even more pathetic than I had been led to believe. Secondly, I am unconvinced that this is the easiest nor the most efficient way to kill something with a sword, but as I am no expert, I will defer to Shad. Thirdly, I assume that stabbing in the gut will only work if the orc is not wearing armor, which is of course never mentioned nor accounted for. We then get two further pieces of information that reinforce that the Numenorians are not a militaristic people. Firstly, we were already told that the best they can do is 500 soldiers. Secondly, they are training in a random alleyway rather than a barracks. Thirdly, they required volunteers and thus presumably do not have a standing army. And fourthly, they are using real swords for training rather than practice swords. Fifthly, Elendil states that anyone who can land a hit on Galadriel will be promoted to lieutenant, suggesting that they do not have any lieutenants, or at the very least do not have enough. All of this suggests that Numenor is not a military power.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
Given this fact, we can assume that Galadriel, with all her thousands of years of worldly experience, would be very much aware of this, and thus would likely have no reason to go to great lengths to recruit Numenor's army, if for no other reason than that it does not appear to have one.
Oh yeah. It's all coming together.
Anyway, back to the scene. The recruits try to land a hit on Galadriel in order to get that sweet, sweet promotion. I have no idea why this is the criteria for a promotion. I am trying to imagine Elendil conducting a job interview for lieutenants and asking, "So what are your qualifications?" And then the recruit says, "Yeah, so I landed a hit on some elf girl." And then Elendil says, "Well, seeing as how lieutenants don't need to have any skills beside competence with a sword, you don't need to be strong leaders or tacticians or good at speaking and managing people, you can have the job, well done." So anyway, we have these 5 randos, one of whom is Isildur's angry buddy who looks kind of like the Rock with an afro. He approaches Galadriel and attempts to land a hit on her. Without going into too much detail beyond what I as a layman understand about sword fighting, Afrock is repeatedly attempting to strike Galadriel by not actually aiming at her, or by massively overswinging and thus making obvious his intended target. Galadriel tells the recruits,
"Swordsmanship is about balance rather than strength. Fight with your feet, not your arms."
But what does that have to do with anything?
No. He's got a point.
This is something that sounds like it makes sense until you think about it and realize that strength and arms are actually pretty important in sword fighting. Galadriel later says that brute strength is not how you defeat an orc. It is usually easier to outmaneuver them, suggesting that the orcs are stronger than men or elves. Throughout the scene, we see multiple times the fabric of reality bending to make Galadriel appear to be a masterful and unparalleled fighter, in that she is able to appear vastly more skilled than the recruits. However, this is due to things like the recruits giving her their swords, aiming at places that are not her, them aiming for her swords instead of aiming at her body, and accidentally falling over for no reason.
Pretty pathetic, huh?
Galadriel said at the start of the scene something which implies that she considers them to be at least semi-competent fighters, and she would have no reason to lie to Elendil. If she were addressing the recruits themselves, we might assume that maybe she wants to boost their confidence by complimenting them, but as she was only speaking to Elendil, we have to assume she was being truthful. And yet, once again, what this scene tells us is that the recruits are good, but Galadriel is, of course, the best. What this scene actually shows us is that the recruits are terrible, and Galadriel is mediocre. Anyway, the outcome of this scene was that Afrock lands a hit on Galadriel's dress, even though specifically the requirement was to be the first to draw flesh, and he is promoted. I will highlight here as well that Galadriel was supposed to teach the recruits how to kill an orc, but instead she spent the entire scene dancing around showing off and giving out meaningless advice. It may have been more interesting to see her demonstrate how an orc may fight, but I guess it's more important to have the cool scene rather than to have the sensible scene. Halbrand, who had been watching the fight, then picks up Afrock's sword, does a little flourish with it, and then gives it back to him. Why he did this?
I have no fucking idea.
And this causes Galadriel to comment,
Never known a smith's aide who could do that.
Oh yeah, it's all coming together.
Okay, so Galadriel is apparently very talented at sword fighting. I know that's not what the scene actually told us, but it's what they wanted to have told us. And she does not understand why a blacksmith might be skilled at handling swords. We then see Pharazon's son Kemen attempting to convince him not to go to war. We learn that Pharazon is the Queen Regent's cousin, which maybe I missed, or maybe this is the first time we've been told this. Either way, Kemen is telling his father that he is the Queen Regent's cousin, which is yet another example of someone telling someone else something that they already know. Pharazon is not receptive to his son's pressuring, stating that he prefers to swim with the current rather than against it. This seems to be in line with what we have seen from him before. Kemen then tells his father that he had single-handedly prevented the last king from dragging them back to their old ways, suggesting that therefore he could now sway the Queen Regent from going to war. Again, he is telling Pharazon something that Pharazon already knows. Apart from that, though, this suggests that Pharazon was a key player, or potentially the player, behind dethroning the previous king, which would be in line with his established dislike of elves.
So by the calluses on my hands, I swear that elven hands will never take Numenor's helm.
It is, however, out of line with Pharazon's stated desire to not kick against the current.
It's folly to kick against the current. You see, the tide may rise and drown a man, or fall and sweep him out to sea.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
We also have no idea why Pharazon did this previously, and as a result have no idea what he specifically did, and therefore there is no reason to assume that his past actions with removing the king would have any bearing on his ability to change the Queen Regent's mind. His son seems to be saying, you changed someone's mind before, so you can do it again, which isn't how that works.
My father would sooner die than take orders from an elf.
This causes Pharazon to motion in a very subtle way to the citizens to leave so that he can address his son privately. I quite like this, as it adds a bit of tension, and it suggests that Pharazon is so familiar and influential with the people of Numenor that he can clear a room without even opening his mouth. It also tells us that the citizens either respect or fear him, or potentially both. Pharazon then clarifies that he does not take orders from Galadriel, and that when this is all over, the elves will take orders from Numenor. He states that the Queen Regent may be going to war for Galadriel, whereas he is going to war for Numenor. His intentions are that they will clear out the orcs in the Southlands, put Halbrand on the throne, and in so doing receive trades and tribute and wealth from them. This, whilst seems in character as it shows him to be a very patriotic person who cares for men above all other races but specifically for Numenor above other regions, doesn't explain why the elves will be taking orders from them, unless his plan is to become more technologically advanced than the elves and acquire buckets of cash, get really, really rich, and then throw his weight around, even though Numenor apparently has no established military might to back this up.
Oh yeah, it's all coming together.
Put more simply, Pharazon's endgame is for Numenor to prosper, and so his plan is to allow the Queen to send 500 recruits to a war thousands of miles away, in the hopes that the end result is that Halbrand is so grateful for him doing this that he pays him tribute afterwards. Strange plan, and I can only assume it will make less sense as the show continues. Okay, so Pharazon is extremely influential, does not respect his son, is either feared or respected by Numenorians, despises elves, prefers to swim with the current rather than against it. Cut to Queen Regent Miriel and her father, who believes Numenor is in danger, and Miriel reassures him that they are doing what he wanted them to do previously by returning to Middle-earth and fixing their relations with the elves. Her father seems to barely understand what she is saying.
Miriel.
Yes.
And then says that she shouldn't go as all that awaits her there is darkness. Does he know this? Has the Palante driven him mad? Is he just a frail old guy who's a bit nuts? Well, I guess we'll have to not have answers to those questions either because the writers are incompetent buffoons or because those answers are inconveniently locked behind a legal contract. Also, we're about 30 minutes early for a cliffhanger. What is going on? Wait, I'm only 28 minutes into this goddamn episode and this script is already as long as my analysis of episode 1. I guess when we have more and more broken material to reference, the reviews will continue getting longer and longer, so prepare yourselves for episode 8 being a bit of a chonker. Anyway, we then cut back to the Harfoots, where Nori is super excitedly telling the stranger that everyone is talking about him rescuing them from the wolves. We see him magicking the water, presumably to cool his hand after, I guess, burning it with fire magic, maybe? I don't know how this works. What Nori does next is rather special. She is seeing ice travel up the arm of a being whom she knows to be capable of otherworldly abilities. He is clearly casting a spell of some kind, as he has done before and as she must be aware. So, she puts her hand on his arm and, oh no, now she's gonna be a little popsicle.
That's a damn stupid thing to do.
Yeah, if this is actually ice, then Nori is losing her fucking arm. No issues with the stranger doing this to himself, as he is a wizard, but of course Nori's arm is just a totally normal, non-magical flesh and bone arm. Then this happens. Oh, okay, so I assume her hand is still totally frozen to the stranger's arm. But of course, it isn't. Nori is fine.
Alrighty then.
So this might sound a little nitpicky, and to a degree it has to be, because we simply don't know how the stranger's magic works. We know that his fire was not hot, or at least the fire surrounding him when he landed was not hot, although it would be a little strange if he were unable to make hot fire. So it is possible that his ice is not cold. But then why does it appear to freeze Nori's hand? It is clearly having a physical effect on her hand, so something is happening. We don't know for sure that this is legit ice. It could be spooky magic ice that has different properties. We simply don't know. Either way, Nori touching it is incredibly stupid.
Do you know what optistic is?
I will note nonetheless that it is jarring and cheap to visually imply something via showing the audience something that looks and behaves like ice to create tension and drama, only for it to not in fact act or behave like ice in order to avoid causing serious harm to one of the main characters. The issue is less that Nori should have lost her hand because that's how ice works, and more that the writers deliberately chose to use the visual of ice knowing it would create tension only to have it be entirely unfounded, presumably due to it being magic ice. In other words, they created drama using a familiar visual that has implied consequences, only for those consequences to not manifest.
Pretty pathetic, huh?
Anyway, this understandably scares Nori, because I guess ain't nobody that brave, and she runs away. The stranger then flexes his magic bones, and the trees move. Okay, so Nori doesn't understand how ice works, and isn't as brave as we were led to believe. We then return to Lindon, which I will remind you is hundreds of miles away from Khazad-dûm and would have taken at least a few weeks for Elrond and Durin to reach. Gil-Galad then asks Durin what secret technology they have discovered without actually saying the word mithril, making blatantly clear that Gil-Galad is highly suspicious that the dwarves have found some kind of breakthrough technology. Durin responds by saying that he might ask the same of him, as the elves have recently been making political moves such as expanding their cities and moving their military around, and he considers this strange as it usually takes them weeks to decide to take a shit. And those are not my words, those are Durin's words, meaning that the phrase take a shit is canonical as having meaning in Amazon's Middle-earth. Lovely. I'm sure Tolkien would be proud.
Pretty pathetic, huh?
Of course, this line is meant to be funny, and it's also meant to convey that the dwarves, or more specifically Durin, can be crass, disrespectful, and rude. And there was of course no way to convey this in any way other than to have a character in Middle-earth use the extremely modern phrase, take a shit. I assume in the next episode, Durin will ask Elrond if he can have a puff on his vape. Anyway, Elrond interrupts Durin and tries to explain away the dwarves' recent flourishing, but Gil-Galad persists. Instead of answering the question, Durin responds by asking Gil-Galad where he got his table.
But what does that have to do with it?
No. He's got a point.
Stating that the rock it is made of only grows at certain depths. And now Rings of Power has lowered me to the point of Googling, do rocks grow? Only to find out that whilst the answer is yes, it is by millimeters over millions of years, which is another way of saying, fuck no, rocks of course do not grow, you noodle brain. He then continues that this rock is particularly valuable due to its rarity, and as such is used for sacred purposes such as monuments or tombs. Gil-Galad apologizes for using it as a dinner table and says he should send it home with Durin. Given that this is a very, very large rock, it must weigh hundreds of tons, if not more. How exactly does Gil-Galad plan to have it transported hundreds of miles back to Khazad-dûm, he asks before remembering that he is watching Rings of Power and realizing that as the table is already here in Lindon, it means that they have a method for doing precisely this, even though such a method cannot exist.
Why me? Why me?
Anyway, Durin appears to accept Gil-Galad's apology, and they drink to the union of elves and dwarves. After the meal, Gil-Galad says whilst he admires Elrond's loyalty to Durin, he is aware that Elrond lied to him about whatever the discovery was that the dwarves have made. This didn't happen in the prior scene, however I think it is reasonable to assume that if Gil-Galad is interested in Mithril, which I assumed previously and is confirmed in this scene, then he would have asked Elrond upon his return to Lindon if he discovered anything. Elrond responds that in actuality Gil-Galad may well have been lying to him. He has finally caught on. Elrond has realized how useful of an idiot he has been. Or I guess you could say how stupidly useful he has been. And given that we now actually have a payoff for this, I can break down how it makes no sense in full. Gil-Galad suspected that the dwarves were hiding some kind of breakthrough which he wanted. Unrelated to this, Celebrimbor wanted to build a forge. Gil-Galad sent Elrond to work with Celebrimbor as he is apparently unable to provide an actual workforce. Elrond decided then to recruit the dwarves, and through a spider's web of insane contrivances and character-breaking decisions, Elrond discovers the Mithril. So, that is what happened. What does it tell us? It tells us that Gil-Galad deliberately sent Elrond to work with Celebrimbor in order to acquire Mithril. He presumably assumed that Elrond would recruit the dwarves, which only happened due to something entirely out of his control, and then at some point afterwards assumed that Elrond would be informed about or discover of his own volition the presence of the Mithril. Put even more simply,
Phase 1.
Send Elrond to work with Celebrimbor.
Phase 2. Phase 3.
Acquire Mithril. This is full-on goddamn spastic mode, and to top it all off, as far as Gil-Galad is aware, he doesn't even have the Mithril. Elrond came back and was like, yeah, they don't have any, sorry, and then Gil-Galad reads him like a lie detector and deduces that yes, the dwarves do indeed have Mithril, which he already highly suspected, meaning all this only accomplished one thing. It confirmed his suspicions, and it only did that because of absolutely batshit contrived nonsense, which if you want more information on, check out my coverage of episode 4. So Durin is rude and disrespectful to Gil-Galad. Elrond is willing to call out when he is being lied to. Wow, this actually happened before. This is some consistency. What is going on? And Gil-Galad is very perceptive, very diplomatic, and has insane plans that rely on blind luck. We then get a pseudo-flashback sequence framed as Gil-Galad asking Elrond to recite a particular story to him. The story is that a tree supposedly containing the last of the lost Silmarils was defended by an elven warrior against a Balrog. At some point during the battle, and for some reason, there was a lightning which magicked their good and bad power into the ground beneath it, and yada yada, it became Mithril. I don't have an issue with this. It seems to be an elven fairy tale or legend or something, so the specifics of how and why this happened are understandably hazy. Gil-Galad, however, believes the story to be true, and that the Mithril has been hidden under the mountains for centuries. Elrond accidentally reveals that the dwarves discovered Mithril by saying that he will never reveal that the dwarves discovered Mithril, and Gil-Galad says, yeah, well, you better tell me or else we're gonna die. Gonna need you to elaborate on that one, Gilgy. He then tells Elrond that the reason he sent Galadriel away in the first place was to stop their tree from being evil.
But what does that have to do with it?
No. He's got a point.
I mean, I know Galadriel is such a detestable individual that she may as well be evil, but I don't quite know why sending her away would stop this tree from dying. If anything, you probably want to keep her around. I am told, repeatedly, that she is the best, and if you send the best away, then the best will not be here when the orcs come knocking.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
Gil-Galad concludes that the light of the Eldar, which he calls our light, is fading. The show is not explaining how or why Gil-Galad has reached this conclusion. It has not explained why this tree is important, or why it is going evil, or why the tree going evil means that their light is fading, or what a Silmaril is, or what the light of the Eldar is. Almost like Amazon bought the rights to a tiny part of Tolkien's work as part of a money-making scheme and so had to hire writers to connect the dots from the appendices of Return of the King without explicitly referencing anything in any of Tolkien's other work, meaning that the end product is something that has gigantic holes in its world building. And he then asks,
did the dwarves find the ore or not?
So this means that his ridiculous convoluted plan was enacted purely to acquire Mithril and in so doing save their light. Elrond for the third time tells Gil-Galad that the dwarves have Mithril by saying he swore an oath not to tell anyone that the dwarves have Mithril.
I swore an oath to Durin.
Gil-Galad responds that if they don't get the Mithril, then the tree will go bad. And if the tree goes bad, then they don't have any light. And if they don't have any light, then they gotta leave Middle-earth. And if they do that, then Sauron will kill everything. Seems to me like if the stakes for acquiring Mithril are this goddamn high, you should be doing more than sending Elrond to work with a guy on a thing and then waiting for him to say hi to the dwarves, maybe, and then accidentally upon the Mithril without telling him that that was his objective.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
Gil-Galad tries to convince Elrond to break his oath with the hopes that doing so would fix the tree and thus stop Sauron, apparently. And the scene ends before Elrond decides what to do because, of course, cliffhanger. Apparently the writers didn't realize that Elrond has already communicated to Gil-Galad that the dwarves do have Mithril, even if he didn't specifically use those words. Okay, Elrond values his friendship over his duty to his king, and is an idiot who can't keep his mouth shut. We then cut back to Numenor, where the locals are pubbing and drinking and generally being happy. Because the scene features these guys, we get more soap opera rom-com bullshit, and then Isildur approaches Afrock to ask him to let him join the army. Before he can, Afrock observes that Isildur is only now trying to apologize for getting them booted from the Sea Guard, because he thinks he can now get him a spot in the army as he has now been promoted.
You're only apologizing because you think I can get you on the expedition. Can you?
So again, this is meant to be funny, I think, but what it does is confirm that Isildur is a scatterbrained, desperate child who doesn't understand that no means no.
See that? 50 no's and a yes means yes.
He tried to ask his daddy and was rejected on the grounds that he has no valid qualifications and that he has a history of bailing on things, so now he's asking his friend, who just so happens to have been promoted, in order to bypass his father. Conclusion: Isildur is a weaselly little entitled prick, and this is played for laughs. Nonetheless, the answer is still no. Isildur is not going to be able to join the army. I wonder how Isildur will be able to join the army.
Don't know, don't care. How's that?
Anyway, his buddy says that Beric, Isildur's horse, was recruited by the Horsemaster and will be going to war.
Sorry, Isil. The sea is always right.
What? God, fucking piss.
The sea is always right! The sea is always right!
Okay, so I had assumed wrongly, evidently, that the sea is always right referred to things that the sea could potentially have been peripherally involved in, such as it being generally dangerous to be at sea, or even that the sea delivered Galadriel to Elendil. I can believe that Elendil believed that, for instance. But apparently Isildur's horse being recruited for war is also a result of the sea being correct.
Why me? Why me?
So Isildur is an entitled little brat and uses people to get what he wants. We then see Pharazon's son Kemen breaking into one of the ships with the clear intent of setting it on fire. This tells us that Kemen is so determined to make sure the Numenorians don't go to war that he is willing to vandalize military equipment. He is willing to do so even though Pharazon explained in detail why the Numenorians should in fact go to war. Is this treason? Like, surely this counts as treason. Seriously, the reasons for going to war are many, of varying validity, and I don't have a better reason for why Kemen is willing to actively prevent this other than that Eärien promised to tickle his pickle. But oh no, there's a man on the boat, so we can't burn it down, and it turns out to be Isildur. Good thing he coughed, I guess, even though he would have heard Kemen and does not want to be discovered and doesn't appear to have any reason to be coughing. If Kemen had accidentally knocked some ash onto the cloth he's hiding under, then fine. But as it is, the only reason Isildur isn't killed in this scene is because he did an unnecessarily loud bodily function. He may as well have farted or burped. Isildur notices that Kemen was about to set the boat on fire, and Kemen tells Isildur to leave and that he won't tell anyone he was there. Instead of doing this, Isildur decides that he has to wrestle the lantern from Kemen in order to accidentally the boat... Oh, it's on fire now. Oh no, the worst possible thing is happening as a result of the characters being total fucking retards. Just another day in Amazon's Middle Earth. So, with the boat now on fire, they run to the upper deck. Kemen runs into a crane, and then they die. Except that they didn't, because the editor wanted to artificially create tension by obfuscating how much time has passed between this shot and this shot. Although saying that, for Isildur and Kemen to survive this, they have to be pretty goddamn far from the ship when it goes boom, and, I mean, they aren't. Either they're on the ship, or they're right behind the ship, and in both cases, they're fucking dead. I guess the director wanted their wide shot for the trailer because it looks cool, even though it creates a plot error. Anyway, Isildur covers for Kemen, and Kemen tells Elendil that Isildur saved his life. So, the explanation Isildur gives as to why 2 of their military ships have just exploded is that Kemen was in a fishing boat at night, and that for some reason a cask on one of the ships went up. Kemen was then thrown into the water, Isildur presumably saw this, and jumped in to get him.
Oh yeah, it's all coming together.
That Elendil even believes this for a moment tells us that his character is incredibly gullible. Isildur has a motive for destroying the fleet because he is an immature child who isn't being allowed to do what he wants, and he is suffering the consequences of his own actions. But, just like that, Isildur won't tell on Kemen because he values getting into the army via manipulating his father over protecting Numenorian military assets, meaning that there is no small likelihood that Kemen will actually go on to destroy the remaining 3 ships and thus prevent Isildur from actually going to war in the first place. And Kemen won't tell on Isildur because he values preventing the Numenorians from going to war by presumably blowing up every ship that this seafaring nation has access to over revealing that Isildur was trying to stow away on board. Conclusion? Elendil is a gullible idiot. Isildur is a self-centered scumbag, and Kemen is essentially a vagina-fueled domestic terrorist. Okay, Kemen is willing to vandalize military equipment and risk the lives of everyone nearby in order to get into some sweet, moist pantaloons. And he is extremely selfish and stupid. Isildur acts without thinking, and Elendil is extremely gullible. We then see Elendil addressing Pharazon, saying that they suspect it was vandalism, but they have not yet identified who it was. Already, in one line, we have catastrophic problems. If these were characters instead of plot tools, then Elendil may have said, "Hey Pharazon, you'll never believe this, but your son was out fishing right next to where our military vessels just exploded in the harbor. My son, the disgraced scatterbrained degenerate, rescued him. Crazy thing, right? Anyway, I'm glad he's safe. So who do you suppose tried to blow up our fleet?" And then Pharazon may have replied, "That certainly is weird. My son doesn't know how to fish, he's useless, and my ears close up when he speaks because his voice is so irritating. I think he mentioned something to me earlier about really not wanting us to go to war, but I wouldn't know because my ears were closed. Yeah, it must have just been some passing arsonist. Case closed." Anyway, Galadriel also reassures the Queen Regent that she should not let this change her mind. Pharazon disagrees with this and suggests that they acted too quickly in agreeing to sail to the Southlands. He suggests delaying their departure until they can win more hearts to their cause. Even if, as depicted, we accept that Pharazon does not know that it was his son who blew up their ships, I do not believe that he would falter on going to war. He has already explained why he is highly motivated to do so. Galadriel replies that they must act quickly as their enemy grows stronger every day. We then learn that
we still have 3 ships.
So, the time has come. I can't hold it any longer. You're telling me that prior to this explosion, Numenor had 5 ships. This is like expecting me to believe that Rohan has 5 horses. Telling me that a prosperous island nation only has 5 fucking boats is like telling me that the Galactic Empire only has 5 spaceships. I don't believe you. This is absurd. Anyway, the Queen Regent decides that the four of them will reconvene the following day to make a final decision, and Galadriel is to make sure Halbrand is there too. We then cut back to Lindon, where Celebrimbor reveals to Elrond that he knew of Gil-Galad's ultimate goal of acquiring Mithril. So before I comment on the elephant in the room, this doesn't actually make Gil-Galad's plan any more coherent. The idea to approach the dwarves was Elrond's, and it is possible that Gil-Galad expected this, although the decision was made solely by Elrond. Elrond's decision to return to Khazad-dûm months later, as we see in episode 4, did happen due to Celebrimbor saying something was bothering him, but even this doesn't function as intended. If Celebrimbor's goal was to trick Elrond into going to Khazad-dûm to try and find some Mithril, then his chosen method of, yeah, so Durin's kind of shady right now or something, is not anywhere near close to sufficient.
Pretty pathetic, huh?
Of course, because Elrond is written by the writers of Rings of Power, he decides to go to Khazad-dûm for essentially no reason, meaning that regardless of whether or not Celebrimbor was manipulating him, everything just so happened to have worked out exactly as planned. Anyway, Elrond asks Celebrimbor what he makes of the Mithril, and at this point I have to engage beast mode. Deep breath. So, as I explained in great detail in episode 4, the method by which the writers had Elrond physically acquire a piece of Mithril is utterly broken. Everything that happens from this point on is as a direct result of Elrond and Durin acting horribly out of character alongside a long list of contrivances that I feel will only get longer on rewatch. Part of the way Elrond ends up with the Mithril is by swearing an oath to Durin that he will not tell anyone about it. In an earlier scene, Elrond refused to reveal to Gil-Galad that he has a piece of Mithril in his pocket, even though doing so would mean that the elves do not have to leave Middle-earth, and, if Gil-Galad is correct, would prevent Sauron from taking over the world. Elrond values his oath to Durin over any threat of the world being assaulted by the armies of darkness. However, because this is a show for smart people, it also revealed that Elrond had already broken his oath to Durin because he had given the Mithril to Celebrimbor to test and determine what its properties are.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
The only thing I can draw from this is that Elrond places no value whatsoever in his oath to Durin, which is contrary to what the show keeps telling us their relationship is. Anyway, Celebrimbor says that nothing diminishes the Mithril's light, and that if they can acquire enough of it quickly, they can saturate every last elf in the light of the Valar, and that it very well could be their only salvation. Of course, the show has not explained how having Mithril equals fixing trees or giving elves light, so none of this really means anything other than that they really want Mithril to save their species. Celebrimbor apologizes again, and this, plus the fact that he has apparently not revealed to Gil-Galad that he is in possession of Mithril, would suggest that in this scene in episode 4...
either he's avoiding me, or he's hiding something.
Celebrimbor was in fact not being manipulative. He was showing genuine concern for Durin. After apologizing, Elrond replies,
I am sorry that the High King deceived me, or that now our people are doomed unless I break an oath and betray a friend.
Motherfucker, you already broke your oath. You already betrayed your friend. Celebrimbor knows about the Mithril. You promised not to tell anyone, and yet you have told someone. God damn it. Okay, so Elrond values his oath so much that he accidentally breaks it repeatedly without realizing. Because this is a show for smart people, guys. We then cut back to Halbrand, and Galadriel, for the second time in the show, apologizes.
I was wrong to use you. For that I am sorry.
Very good, Kronk.
Now then, what does she want from Halbrand that could prompt such an apology? Well, you see, in order to be able to cross the ocean and kill baddies, Halbrand needs to be present at the meeting tomorrow with the Queen, and therefore she is willing to keep her ego at bay and apologize. Meaning, Galadriel is using Halbrand to get what she wants.
I was wrong to use you.
Motherfucker, you are using him right now. You know, the funny thing about characters is that they are inherently only ever as intelligent as the people who write them, which is precisely why we can make categorical statements on the intelligence of the writers of Rings of Power due to the intelligence of the characters that they have written.
Do you know what autistic is?
Anyway, Galadriel shut her ego away for, 2 lines of dialogue, so now it's time for...
Stop fighting me, and together let us fight them.
Halbrand continues to refuse and reiterates that he despises the fact that his ancestors fought alongside Morgoth. And he continues to explain that he has done things he is not proud of and that his people and Galadriel will cast him out when they learn what he did. In response to Halbrand, Galadriel says,
Sometimes to find the light, we must first touch the darkness.
Oh yeah, so this is the thing Finrod told her. And I guess the reason she's telling Halbrand now is to suggest that whatever he's done can be redeemed if he does the right thing now. I think this is far more morally grey than the writers do, because Galadriel is essentially using Halbrand to get what she wants by telling him, yeah, it's cool if you like murdered kids and ate them or whatever, because if you do what I say now, then I get what I want, so we're good, we're all happy. Halbrand's response to this I actually quite like. He calls her out once again on her self-centered bullshit and demands to know why she keeps fighting.
Why do you keep fighting? You're asking me to go to the one place that I swore never to return. The least you can do is tell me why.
Well, Galadriel, why do you keep fighting?
Why do you keep fighting?
Because I cannot stop.
Fucking course. What the fuck is wrong with this woman?
Pretty pathetic, huh?
But wait, it gets better.
The company I led mutinied against me, and each of them acted as they did, because I believed they could no longer distinguish me from the evil I was fighting.
Okay, so this absolute twat thinks that the reason why she was abandoned by her company in episode 1 was not because she showed utter disregard for their safety or lives for that matter, or that she didn't listen to them and treated them almost like children, or because she was disobeying a direct order from the High King and by proxy so were they. It's because they thought she was indistinguishable from Sauron and Morgoth. Honey, you are a masterclass in how to be a terrible person, but to think that anyone views you as being on the same level of evil as Sauron is to be so self-obsessed as to be unable to understand anyone's point of view other than your own. Which, come to think of it, is pretty in line with what we have come to know about her, so well done, writers, you have accidentally written Galadriel as being the opposite of your intention in a semi-consistent way. You were so incompetent that at every turn you consistently made the same mistakes.
There never was much hope. Just a fool's hope.
I do also find it probably much funnier than I should how back in episode 2, Galadriel said,
It would take longer than your lifetime, even to speak the names of those they've taken from me.
Which, sure, may have been a little hyperbolic rather than literal, but still amounts to around 220 million friends she claims to have lost, and yet in this very scene where she is bearing her heart to Halbrand and explaining why she does what she does, she says, yeah, my brother died, and my company mutinied. Yeah. Almost like the writers forgot. Or maybe they remembered, but they don't have the rights. Anyway, the short version of the rest of this scene is that Galadriel convinces Halbrand that they are both damaged people who will not find peace in Numenor, and they must cross the sea to fulfill their destinies. Okay, so Galadriel is willing to manipulate people to get what she wants, whilst apologizing to them for manipulating them to get what she wants. We then see that Waldreg has led the people from Ostirith to Adar. He swears allegiance to Sauron, which causes Adar to attack him, implication being that Adar is not in fact Sauron. Who saw that coming? And Waldreg instead says,
I'll serve you then. There you are.
Man, just let me be evil. I really want to help the evil people. Gosh diddly darn it, I do love being evil. Adar then tells Waldreg that if he wants to serve, he must kill Captain Racism, which he then appears to do. Now, I dislike racists as much as the next misogynist, but I kind of feel bad for Rowan here, even though both he and Waldreg are pretty paper thin in terms of characterization. One idea that could have been effective would have been to establish that Rowan is Waldreg's son. This could contextualize Rowan's slightly xenophobic leanings. It could allow for Waldreg learning through Rowan that Theo has the evil sword rather than just guessing, and it could have meant that his decision to murder him in the name of evil has a little more weight to it. Anyway, we then see Arondir teaching Theo to shoot a bow. Notably, they are the only two people doing it. I assume everyone else is kind of chill with dying. Arondir says,
Why bother trying to teach me?
Because it took me over 200 years to develop the bravery that's keeping me standing here tonight.
This is an interesting clarification. This presumably means that Arondir is only 200 years old, which is very young for an elf. He could, I guess, be 1500 years old and only started learning to be brave when he was 1300, but I'm going to assume that that isn't what was intended here. Theo is not optimistic about their survival chances and doesn't understand why Arondir is staying to die with them.
All my life your kind has watched us, counting every whisper, every kitchen knife too sharp. We're all about to be buried in this tower, so why be buried with us?
Because in counting the whispers and the knives, I've come to know the voices and the hands of those behind them.
Alright, I actually like this line. It's articulate enough without being hammy. Anyway, Theo's response is,
Half of us just left.
Oh yeah, Arondir, remember when that happened and you just kind of let it happen? You didn't exactly try very hard to stop anyone leaving.
But half stayed.
Yes, Arondir, that is indeed how halves work. Anyway, Theo appears to warm up to Arondir and decides to reveal the evil sword to him. Arondir recognizes it, but does not know exactly what it does. It certainly is a good thing that Waldreg didn't bring it with him when he went to kneel before Adar, but as that would have been in character for Waldreg, and it would have meant the bad guys don't have to attack Osterith to get it, we can't be having that, can we? Something that makes sense in Rings of Power? Not on my watch. Anyway, Arondir says they can survive because there must be a way, which prompts Bronwyn to momentarily consider leaving to kneel before Adar.
No! Bow to the enemy, and you take away everything. From your son, his son's after him. Your people have worked an entire age to earn back their virtue. But you undo it all in just one moment of despair. There must be another way.
Name it. I beg you.
Well, I was not expecting this. Bronwyn has a character flaw. Whether this character flaw is appropriate for her character, and whether the revelation of this character flaw is justified, however, is another question, especially given that the last time we saw Bronwyn, she was doing a girl boss. Anyway, they then remember that the garrison has a watchtower, and that is a criticism for another day. Okay, so Arondir is devoted to protecting the Southlanders. Theo warms to Arondir after he observes his commitment, and Bronwyn, given the right circumstances, is pessimistic to the point of considering being evil. Cut back to, oh, fuck, wow, okay, we are doing this. I guess this rock doesn't weigh anything. It must be a magic rock. Fine, I guess, although the idea that these 6 elves are just gonna carry this fucking thing hundreds of miles whilst evidently struggling to hold the weight is ridiculous. This also confirms that the method of transportation for crossing the entire goddamn continent of Middle-earth is to walk, even if it will take you weeks, if not months. And of course, with this being Rings of Power, no food, no water, no supplies, they just walk. I never thought I'd say this, but the goddamn Harfoots have a better mode of transportation than you. At least they have wheels.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
You made it up, didn't you?
This has been wanting a new table for years, so...
Alright, this is mildly amusing. It certainly was a bold move, however, to assume that Gil-Galad would firstly not know where his table came from, and secondly would not know what it was made out of. Whilst I can buy Durin doing something like this, given that we know him to be brash and confident, this gambit of lying to Gil-Galad is extremely high risk and extremely low reward. If it fails, diplomatic relations between elves and dwarves potentially disintegrate, possibly leading to war, given that the elves apparently desperately need Mithril. If it succeeds, Durin has a table. Certainly worth.
Why me? Why me?
Elrond evidently wants to tell Durin something along the lines of, oh yeah man, I totally gave that mithril to Celebrimbor because fuck you and your oath, boy. And in return, Durin demands Elrond's penis.
Give me the meat, and give it to me raw.
Well, that took a turn. I guess maybe Durin does have a piece on the side. Elrond just wasn't aware that that piece was him. Anyway, Elrond proceeds to further retcon his motivations, saying he came to Khazad-dûm as an unknowing stooge to acquire mithril for Gil-Galad, and admits that he was a useful idiot for the king. Good of him to acknowledge it, at least. Elrond explains to Durin how valuable the mithril is to the elves, and that their immortal souls will dwindle into nothing unless they can fix their tree. I think. Again, the show hasn't been clear with this at all, and whilst some of this could very well be explained in future, maybe, this really should have been explained properly if it is going to drive the story. As I understand it from what the show has told us, the magic trees are dying as a result of Sauron doing evil in the south, and in order to fix the trees, the elves need this magical MacGuffin that just so happens to have been discovered very recently. Otherwise, the tree dies, the elves die, everyone dies. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the stakes as we have been informed by Rings of Power. Anyway, Durin appears to agree to help, but acknowledges that they will have to convince his father. So far, Elrond has forgotten about Durin for 20 years, tried to rekindle their friendship because he wants something, spied on him, lied to him, broken an oath multiple times, and revealed that not only does Gil-Galad want mithril, he wants a metric fuckton of it immediately. I could potentially believe that Durin could be convinced to help the elves, but I do not believe that Durin would be convinced by what Elrond just told him. Okay, so Durin is gullible and makes extremely risky political moves in the name of Table, and Elrond is a terrible friend and is a moron. We return to Numenor and see Halbrand considering what to do as the guards approach. He agrees to accept the Queen's summon, transforms into Aragorn, and evidently convinces the Queen and Pharazon to go ahead and depart for Middle-earth. They march through the streets, load their boats, all 3 of them, and we see that Isildur was apparently allowed to join the army because no one has any idea who his father is. Elendil tells his son to report to the Horsemaster, which means that they are not only expecting me not to notice that there aren't any horses on these boats, let alone enough for 500 soldiers, but they are in fact expecting me not to notice it after explicitly telling me that the Horsemaster is on board. My bad. I keep forgetting that if it isn't on screen, it doesn't exist. Rule number 1 for writing Amazon's Rings of Power. So now is as good a time as any to comment on the size of the Numenorian army. Currently, they have no idea how many orcs are in the Southlands. All they have to go on is Galadriel reading the MacGuffin scroll in episode 3, and that scroll was very vague. So, either they are deliberately sending only 500 people as something of a scouting party, which makes a little more sense but unfortunately is not mentioned at any point, or 500 people and 5 boats was in fact the best they could do, which is unfortunately supported by many scenes in this episode. Elendil said previously that they had more volunteers than they could accommodate, which suggests that manpower is not the limiting factor. This means either they don't have enough boats, which doesn't make any sense, or they don't have any kind of structured military leadership, which seems to be the case, but is fundamentally unbelievable, or they don't have enough resources like food or weaponry to physically send more than 500 people to Middle-earth, which again, I simply cannot accept that this is the case. The only explanation that makes sense is that they deliberately restricted the army to 500 people, but this is never mentioned in the show. Anyway, Galadriel also boards and is revealed to be wearing a very ornate set of armor, which means I have to assume not only that the Queen Regent happened to have a suit of elven armor lying around, but that it also happened to be available in 5'3". Anyway, they depart and set sail for Middle-earth, and presumably the next time we see them it will be in about a month's time given the distance, or maybe not, because ignoring distance and time is rule number 2 for writing Amazon's Rings of Power. Okay, so we are now at the point in the video where it is time to look at each of the 4 main plot threads and determine what the purpose of each was and how the writers chose to accomplish their goals. Starting with the Nori plot, this plotline does not take up a huge amount of the episode, but its purpose seemed to be to develop Nori's friendship with the stranger and resolve to some degree the conflict between her people and the stranger, which resulted in her family being left behind. I don't have a huge amount of issues with what they did here, at least not in terms of characterization. The biggest character error, in my view, was the final scene with Nori putting her hand on the magic ice, which, even if Nori is curious and brave, etc., is not something any sane individual would ever do. The problems with this plotline come in the form of presentation and, surprise, surprise, contrivance. The manner in which the stranger saves Malva, which will presumably lead to the Harfoots coming to accept the stranger as not being a threat, only occurred because Nori's family apparently were able to catch up with the other Harfoots, because there were wolves in a location where they should not and would not be, because Malva wandered off on her own, because Nori and Poppy also wandered off on their own, and because the stranger has impeccable timing. Once again, this seems to be a case where the writers began with their end goal of having the stranger prove himself to Malva, who seems to be the person who dislikes him the most, thus forcing her to develop as a character. We don't see the development during this episode, I'm just assuming that this might be the case given what did happen during this episode, although at this point it would not surprise me if they just glossed over it. In order to make this happen, Malva, Poppy, and Nori all had to put themselves in danger for no justifiable reason, and the stranger had to miraculously appear to save them just in time. This plotline also does not address the absurdity of Malva specifically seemingly having no moral problem with leaving Nori and her entire family to die in the wilderness, which is not something I believe the show is ever going to acknowledge as being as ridiculously evil as it is. So, whilst there are pretty substantial issues with this plotline, it is definitely the most coherent, at least when compared with the others from episode 5. Now onto the Southlands plot. This plotline needed to establish the imminent threat of Adar's attack, have half of the civilians abandon Osterith in order to side with Adar, and to develop Bronwyn, Theo, and Arendir's relationships. Again, this plotline consists of 2 scenes, but oh boy are these scenes chock full of issues. The stakes of this plotline are entirely unclear, because this episode did not flesh out the geography of the Southlands whatsoever, meaning we still have no idea why they can't just leave. Bronwyn is out of nowhere apparently a strong charismatic leader, but also easily pushed into seriously considering kneeling before Adar herself. Waldreg reveals himself to be extremely dedicated to being evil, which is an interesting worldview, as evil people are usually unaware that they are in fact evil. This also contextualizes one of his earlier scenes where he doesn't believe Bronwyn when she returns with news of Hordon's demise. So, let me lay out the character of Waldreg as we understand him to be. He is an old creepster who runs the pub. He is a worshipper of Sauron, and he has an evil sword hidden in his barn. His objective is to defect to the enemy and presumably take as many people with him as possible. Whether this is due to him just being a bit of an asshole or a corrupted bloodline or something, I don't know because the show doesn't flesh this out. Pretty simple character, no doubt, but pretty well defined. So, the character of Waldreg, as I have just described him, is met with Bronwyn in episode 2 after her return from Horden with tales of destruction and doom. Waldreg downplaying this makes sense given his motivation and his allegiance to Sauron, and he very much appears to have the support of the people of Tirharad, even if they don't necessarily know that he is evil. Then, because of the convenient tunnel boy knocking on Bronwyn's floor, she returns a few minutes later with the head of an orc. Bronwyn arriving with an orc head convinces both Waldreg and the people of Tirharad that they should abandon the village and head for Ostirith. It would be far more appropriate for Waldreg to oppose this because firstly he is far older than Bronwyn and appears to have the support of the citizens, if anything he is their leader, and secondly because presumably Waldreg would want the orcs to arrive in Tirharad so that he can kneel before whomever he believes to be Sauron and present to him the evil sword. There is no reason for Waldreg to go to Ostirith only to then leave the next day, and I do not believe that this character would do this. Anyway, the evil sword is revealed to Arondir by Theo as a result of a small amount of character development, which I actually appreciated, if only because it is the one single instance of character development in this entire episode, because Waldreg for some reason decided not to take the evil sword from Theo in the previous episode. There is simply no reason why he would not do this, because he knows that he himself is evil, and he knows that his plan is to defect and kneel before the enemy, whereas he only suspects that Theo is of the same mind. I explained why this doesn't make any sense in episode 4, but even if we accept that he thinks Theo is on the same team as him, there is no reason not to take the evil sword from him. You do not leave your super important evil MacGuffin in the hands of a child. If that had happened, however, then Adar would have no reason to attack Ostirith, or at least he would have far less of a reason. I won't know the consequences of this until I watch episode 6, however, so until then I can't comment any further. And in case we had forgotten, the only reason Arondir and Theo are even alive is because the orcs inexplicably chose not to kill Arondir, which again I covered in episode 4. And the only reason why the orcs were even able to kill Arondir in the first place was because he acted like a moron in episode 2 and went off exploring on his own, meaning that this entire plot thread continues to be propelled by nonsense. We do see bits and pieces of Adar, but we don't really learn anything substantial about him, so again, until we get some kind of payoff, I can't really provide any praise or criticism. So, overall, this plotline does set up the conflict that I assume will take place in episode 6, but it only accomplishes this by having Waldreg act totally out of character by not taking the evil sword with him. Now onto the Elrond plot. This plotline needed to explain why Gil-Galad wanted the Mithril in the first place and to put to rest any future conflict that Durin may have as a result of this. As I have already explained in detail, this sequence of events does not make any sense. Gil-Galad's plan did not make a lick of sense because it relied on Elrond doing things he had no reason to do. Additionally, Elrond is insufferable in this plotline now because he seems to flip-flop between respecting and caring deeply for Durin and accidentally breaking his oath to him multiple times without realizing. The only conclusion that can be drawn from this is that Elrond is both an idiot and that he does not care for Durin in the slightest, which of course I do not believe to be the writer's intent, but that is what happens when unintelligent people try to write intelligent characters. Durin has been turned into an extremely trusting and gullible fool, when what Elrond admits to him at the end is essentially that Durin was right in his suspicion the entire time, but that Elrond himself was too stupid to actually realize that he was being used. There are ways to convince a character like Durin that the elves legitimately need help, but the way to do it is not to have a character Durin has no reason to trust tell him that if he doesn't help them, Middle-earth will be wiped out. From Durin's perspective, this must sound ridiculous. From the audience perspective, this sounds ridiculous too, because the show has not explained with anywhere near sufficient detail what the stakes here actually are. Anyway, I'm going to move on now because this video is already going to be long enough. Now, on to the meat of episode 5.
And give it to me raw.
It is time to dissect the Numenor plot. When we left off in episode 4, the Queen Regent had decided that Numenor will go to war for reasons that are, in a word, nonsense. This plotline needed to resolve Isildur's interrelational drama and have him end up earning his place in the army. It needed Galadriel to finally convince Halbrand to help her. And by the end of the episode, it needed the Numenorian army to depart for Middle-earth. Where do I even fucking begin? Let's start with Galadriel and Halbrand. Halbrand is now working as a blacksmith because he has acquired a guild crest in a way that does not make sense. Galadriel then uses Halbrand in order to convince the Queen to go to war, evidently not caring in the slightest that Halbrand has repeatedly shown no desire to do so. He demonstrates thoroughly and clearly that he does not appreciate Galadriel doing this and says he will not be going with them. This accomplishes two things. It continues to depict Galadriel as a manipulative and selfish cow, and it reinforces that Halbrand would like to live a simple life on Numenor as a blacksmith. The second scene with Galadriel and Halbrand needed to result in her finally convincing him to come with them. The way it accomplishes this is by having Galadriel apologize for manipulating him in order to get what she wants, whilst manipulating him in order to get what she wants. And the show is evidently unaware that she is doing this because neither character seems to be remotely aware of it either. She convinces Halbrand that neither of them will find peace in Numenor, which she can't know to be true for Halbrand, meaning that she is projecting her own feelings onto him. Of course, because she is Galadriel, she will turn out to be absolutely correct. The way this scene plays out is utterly laughable and is built on nonsense. Halbrand has no reason to believe or trust Galadriel, and Galadriel has no reason to have believed in the first place that Halbrand was the king of the Southlands. Meanwhile, Pharazon's son Kemen has been convinced by Eärien that going to war is a bad idea. The only reason I can think of as to why he would think this, especially after Pharazon explains to him in detail why they are going to war, is because he wants to boof Eärien's happy sacks. This is a motivation, however it is a rather thin motivation considering what he ends up doing next. Kemen first tries to convince his father that going to war is a bad idea, and he fails to do so. He then decides that he will actively prevent the Numenorians from being able to go to war by destroying their fleet. Luckily for him, the fleet consists of only 5 ships. Luckily for him, there are no guards protecting their extremely valuable and inexplicably limited military assets. Unluckily, though, Kemen has no idea how to efficiently blow up a boat without blowing himself up in the process. If not for Isildur coughing for no reason, Kemen would have blown both of them up in the process. It is incredibly convenient that Kemen chose to blow up the same boat that Isildur just so happened to be hiding on. It is incredibly convenient that Isildur coughed so as to let Kemen know he is there. It is incredibly convenient that Kemen didn't start with a different boat, because if he had, he would be dead, and Isildur would at that point have been a stowaway, which I assume is some kind of treason unless, of course, the sea is always right. And that isn't even the biggest problem with the Numenor plotline. The biggest problem, from my perspective, comes in the form of Isildur. The show establishes that Isildur has no idea what he wants, and yet he is intensely motivated to do whatever it is that he happens to want at any given moment. Elendil sees through this and tells him he will not be joining the army. Isildur then tries to abuse the fact that his friend has just been promoted, and is once again told that the answer is no, for what are very much justifiable reasons. So far, so good. Both Elendil and Afrock acted with a degree of principled consistency by refusing to allow Isildur to get what he has not earned and does not deserve. Unfortunately, because I guess Isildur has got to join the army somehow, the writers still needed to find a way to make this happen. So they made Isildur so compelled to go to war that he is willing to stow away on one of the ships the night before. Through sheer absurd levels of unmitigated cosmic luck, Kemen just so happens to be about to explode the boat that Isildur is on. The end result of these two characters crossing paths through chance is that Isildur prevents Kemen from killing himself due to his own incompetence, and lies to his father about what both he and Kemen were doing there. Instead of recognizing that Isildur is quite obviously a suspect in what has just happened, he decides, well, the kid's earned it. He rescued the Chancellor's son who was fishing, I guess. And not only does Elendil choose to do this, but he also apparently chooses not to inform Pharazon. So, in conclusion, the Numenor plot in episode 5 is in the running for the worst we have had in the show so far. Galadriel continues to be reprehensible. Halbrand has become a gullible fool. Isildur is an insufferable and immature prick. Kemen is an incompetent and extremely irresponsible terrorist. Elendil, Pharazon, and the Queen Regent all have a combined IQ of about 70. The only character who comes out relatively unscathed from this episode is Afrock, who may now be my favorite character. Okay, after all that, I have a feeling that episode 3, which until now was the worst of the show, has been replaced by episode 5. When I started doing this series, I was expecting to be able to cover each episode in maybe 30 to 40 minutes. As each episode has gone by, however, the amount of problems have gone up exponentially, likely because the writers simply have more time in which to fuck up and demonstrate their incompetence. In this episode, we had 4 plot lines, one of which is built purely on contrived nonsense. One of which relies on an insanely convoluted plan that relies on characters doing things they would not do. One of which relies on a single character acting totally against his established wants and needs. And one of which that destroys almost any investment I had in its characters by universally depicting them as incompetent buffoons. Simply put, there is nothing functioning in Rings of Power. The dialogue remains terrible. The show continues to depict Galadriel as a super impressive, skilled, admirable, flawless, and remarkable warrior woman without any substance to back it up, whilst also unintentionally showing her to be a manipulative and self-centered harpy. The show attempts to do the same with Bronwyn, totally unjustifiably, only to backtrack her in the following scene, making me wonder what the hell the point of this was. Is there a lesson to be learned here? Maybe, but I'm still working on that. As I have mentioned, I'm planning on covering all 8 episodes and then doing a final autopsy once the whole thing is out, where I draw together the various references from the season as a whole and make conclusive, definitive statements about the various characters and plots. Because, really, until the end of episode 8, everything is pretty much up in the air. As these episodes are getting more and more dense, and I apply both meanings to my use of the word dense, there are going to be larger gaps in between me putting out these videos. I have no intention of rushing them or playing the algorithm, so it will be a case of wait and see. When I hit 500 subs, I'm apparently able to actually make posts on YouTube, and when that happens, I will keep you guys up to date. Until then, though, I hope you continue to enjoy my breakdowns of Rings of Power. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please do consider sharing, liking, or subscribing because it is extremely motivating for me to get these videos finished. Since releasing part 1, my channel has seen a bit of a growth spurt, going from 50 subs to just over 400, so thank you to each and every one of you who has watched my content. As always, if you have any comments, if you agree with me or disagree with me, or if you want to call me names like some exceptional individuals, please leave a comment as I do read all my comments. Thank you again, and I will see you in my next video.